Welcome back to the Start to Finish course on upgrading to .NET Core. We're currently in the module focused on publishing our application. And this lesson, we're going to publish our web application to Azure Web Apps. Okay, so let's go to Visual Studio. The first thing we want to do, just to make sure it's still working, right-click and set as Startup Project. I'm going to launch this. You always want to make sure that your application works before you launch it to Azure Web Apps or to a remote server and then wonder why it's not actually working there. You might spend a lot of time debugging only to find out that the problem is not on their end, it's on your end. And it does seem to work. We're not going to go in depth into using it, but this is working. Now let's right-click and say Publish. And here we can say publish to app services on Linux, to a virtual machine, or to IIS. Or what you can do is you can publish to a folder and then take those files to any web server you want. So everything in the publish folder will then go to your web server and you can set it up and run it. We're going to publish directly to a Windows version of a Azure web app. And the reason why is because I already have a server for Azure Web Apps on Azure. I'm going to use that instead of spending more money. Now, I'm not sure if you know this or not, but Azure Web Apps, you can get 10 of them for free. So this is something you can definitely use for testing. Try it out, see how it works. And then if you want to keep paying for or pay for an upgrade, or if you want more than 10 web apps, then you can consider that. They're actually a pretty reasonable hosting service, especially for the power you get. All right, so Azure App Service, I want to create a new app service. And let's hit Advanced just to see the different options. And there's one option we're going to change, and that is this framework dependent. I'm going to do self-contained. And here is why. Because Azure Web Apps currently does not support .NET Core 3.0, which actually is perfect because not only can we see how to deploy our web app, but how to deploy our web app to an environment that doesn't support it. And the reason why this is great is because you may have some really cheap or even free hosting. Most likely that's Linux hosting, in which case you would change this to Linux 64 or Linux ARM depending on your server, probably 64. But with that Linux hosting, they may not specifically support .NET Core. If they don't have .NET Core installed on that Linux machine, and yes, this is cross-platform, but if they don't have it installed on that machine, not a problem, just change your deployment mode to self-contained. That will publish .NET Core along with your web application. And then it will be able to run on a machine that doesn't typically support .NET Core. All right, so file publish options, we can remove additional files at destination. That's usually good. And the reason why what it does is it cleans off the files that otherwise might not get overwritten. So let's say you have, let's be really simple here, you have one file that you're publishing to your web server, index.html. But on your web server, you have index.html and picture1 and picture2. If you were to redeploy without this checked, it would just overwrite index.html and not get rid of picture1 and picture2. That might be a problem. It might open up some security holes, or it might even just lead to some old information still being available. By checking this box, when you go to publish, it's going to delete those files and then publish in going to publish a brand new website to a brand new app. This has not already been created. It's going to create one as it publishes. Now, once it does that, from then on, it will publish to that web app. I could create storage and a SQL database to associate with this, but for right now, I'm going to leave that alone as well and hit create. This will create that web app and it will publish my files up to it. All right, so it's created the web app and now we're ready to publish. So hit publish. That's going to build my application and it's going to transfer those files up to Azure. And we can watch how that happens, but it's going to take a little bit of time because of the fact that we're not depending on .NET Core on the server. So we have to publish all of those .NET Core files up to the server. All right, the publish has succeeded. And when it succeeded, it also opened up this tracker mvcui.azurewebsites.net site for me. And here's my tournament tracker. So I can create tournaments and do all the rest of the stuff that I normally can. So that's all you have to do to publish your .NET Core upgraded MVC site. Now, with that being said, if your server does support .NET Core 3 or whatever .NET Core version you're currently on, then just change the setting. Instead of self-contained, change it to framework dependent. And then your deployment will be much smaller and you won't have to spend as much time in that deployment process. Now, our specific site has a couple of quirks that we'd need to work through since we've deployed it to Azure. Right now, we save our files, our text files, to a C:/ location. In fact, if we come here to our app.config, we'll see that it is C:/data/tournament tracker. Well, that's not really going to work real well on Azure Web Apps. So what we need to do is change that file path over to be either a storage location or maybe, probably more likely, we don't use the file version for our Azure Web App deployed website. And instead we use a SQL version. But again, we can't just use the local SQL. We're going to have this be an Azure accessible SQL server. Well, a SQL database on Azure costs $5 a month. You could create one of those and put your connection string, replace that connection string with a connection string for that Azure Web App to be the Azure SQL database. And then you can point to that and use it just fine. So there's a lot of different ways you can go about this, but just make sure you do handle the idea of your data because it will appear as though it works. I mean, you saw the application runs. So if I open this up, I could even come in here and say, create tournament. And it says, oh, there's no people, there's no prizes. And if I say test and hit create, it seems like it works, but nothing really happens. There's no teams. I can create a new one. Test at test.com and 5551212 and hit create. Minimum length of 10. Okay, so the area code is 212. Create. It seems like it's doing something, but nothing's happening. That's because it's not being able to write those files. Now, that does indicate to us that we need better error handling and reporting. And that brings up the next thing, and that is our logger writes to a text file. Our logger should probably write somewhere else that's more accessible than a text file. Don't forget that when you publish, one of the things that happens under this file publish options is remove additional files at destination. You're going to remove your log files if your log files are TXT files, even if they got written to the server at all, which they probably didn't. So you're going to need to change your logging to point to a different location. That's not a problem because logging is fairly simple to configure. If we go to our program.cs, actually our startup, and in here We didn't even configure logging for this one, did we? Okay, so in this one, so if you have your serial log set up and you have write to file, you could say write to SQL, or you could write to something else and just use that sync instead. So we add the file sync, but instead you could add the SQL sync or a MongoDB sync or a SQLite sync or something else and write to that. So those are things to think through as you publish, but the actual publish itself was fairly straightforward. The one thing to know was how to do the self-contained if your server does not support the .NET Core in general, because it will still run. You just need to publish self-contained. Okay, so that's it for publishing using the Azure Web Apps or anything else really, because you can publish to something else besides Azure Web Apps, including to a file or IIS or something else.